Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a localization architect at On Purpose Studio. I help companies kind of audit their localization tech stack and help them make it slightly less miserable. One of the common things I come across are developers who took the D.R.Y principles, don't repeat yourself, and they applied them to translation strings. And the typical approach an engineer takes by default kind of makes their life a little more difficult. And so I wanted to talk through that quickly today. Quick review, what is D.R.Y? So if you're an engineer on an engineering team and you have several code bases, you sometimes see yourself having patterns across those code bases. So you think, hey, instead of maintaining individual copies of this piece of code, I'm going to pull that out into a shared resource and then share it among the projects. And so that way I can really make one change in one spot and it automatically is used in all of the code bases. So this is a really good practice, and it's really common in development teams and works really well. So let's talk about how sometimes engineers think about translation strings in this way. So again, you have three projects. They all have very similar strings. You as a developer have this D.R.Y principle trained into you, and you say, hey, these are really similar. I'll bet if we use just the same phrase across multiple projects and we put all that into one single resource, there would be a lot of benefits. Those benefits could be easier to automate with translations. You won't have to retranslate content that from one project that you've already translated in another, and it's really all the strings are in one singular place, and you can do some really good QA on it. So these are really good benefits, and it makes sense why an engineer would do it. So let's talk through the actual implementation of this. Usually they look across the code bases and they say, okay, well, this one kind of fits all the criteria. So they move this string into this shared translation resource. And they say, okay, all three of the code bases now reference this new key called my shared key in this example. But this actually doesn't help you in the way you think. As you see, you still have three individual strings that you're still having to maintain in the code base. And beyond that, you have a fourth that now, if any three of the projects accidentally have a typo in the key, or it changes in the root project, or now you're dealing with versions, and this will actually break the translation depending on your code base. Maybe you have some fallback value. So this really didn't achieve much because you're still having to maintain strings in each individual code base, and it creates a potential bug. Another problem with this is that this makes a lot of sense to engineers, but not really to product managers, designers, copywriters. This sort of mindset of the D.R.Y principle isn't really as common practice in this way, or using this kind of architecture. And so the people that are actually writing the content have a hard time adapting to an engineer's expectations around the D.R.Y principle. So what you often have is you have product managers, designers, content writers that are really frustrated about having to deal with this engineering architecture of this shared repo, and it gets really hard to release translation release correctly. So I want to talk about the best way to apply this principle using common localization best practice. And that's by using a TMS. So a TMS is called the Translation Management System. There are a lot of vendors out there. All of them have very similar features. They're all structured in roughly the same way. And so let's talk about how you can use a TMS to apply the same principle. So we're back to our three code bases. And instead of seeing them as the same resource, you as a developer can think of them as completely unique within each individual project. Even if the content themselves is literally the exact same string, with a TMS, you don't really have to think about that. You can have your project key names make sense only for that project. You don't have to worry about some huge massive repo and making sure there's no conflicts. All you have to care about when you're using a TMS is that specific code base. And so whenever you have the TMS, you have typically a project per code base. And so you move those strings into the project. Again, you as a developer don't have to care what the content is. You don't have to care if there's a match somewhere else. You are not really responsible for this efficiency. Once it's into the translation management system, every TMS has a feature called translation memory. And so whenever it receives a piece of content, it says, hey, have I ever translated this individual piece of content before? And so usually that you have a source language within your code. So in my case, it would be ENUS. And the translation memory would say, hey, have I ever received an ENUS value and have I ever translated that into my target language, let's say Dutch. And if it has seen that value, it will immediately push it back into your project. So there will never be a retranslation step. You'll never have to pay for it if you've paid for it already, and if it's already gone through that translation process. There's a lot of configurations you can set in a translation memory, so you can tell it, hey, I only want to know if it's a 100% exact match, or you can say, 90% is good enough. There's a lot of features you can tweak whenever you're within a TMS, depending on which vendor you choose. If the translation memory has never seen this translation before, it goes through the normal translation process. You can use a human for that. You can use an LLM for that. If you're within a TMS, they all support various types of AI translations. And so this can be an immediate turnaround if you're going to the modern LLMs, or it can be a human translator. There's also approval steps. So there's a lot of ways to grow once you're in a TMS. Once the translation is complete, it will now remember that indefinitely into the translation memory. So let's go back to those benefits. Using a TMS, you can still automate LLM translations. You don't have to retranslate the content, and TMS features often have a really in-depth QA kind of features, and so that's also there as well. You as a developer, you don't really have to care about any of that. It fits in the mental model that your product design or product managers, designers, and copywriters have. And so you as a developer don't really have to stress about managing the same translation key across multiple projects. You can just sort of leave that to your non-technical teams and rely on the TMS features to give you the benefits that you were getting from the repo, but now you can have additional functionality and you can grow with all the same benefits. So I hope this was helpful. My name's Aaron. Reach out to me anytime if you have more questions about your localization tech stack. Have a good day.